All right, game number 3. Hikaru with the black pieces, Niko with white. Let's jump in. We have e4, e5. This is called the e4, knight of 65. The Alekhine's defense moves coming in fast. Um, this opening not played as much in classical chess anymore. It's giving white an opportunity to get a sizable space advantage. I'm not so familiar with all the lines, but I do remember Daniel Naroditsky playing it in the U.S. Championships, and was very surprised he chose it as an opening choice. Okay, white has a very solid position here. Good pawn structure in the center. Black lacks a little bit of space. Um, but now the position has changed. Black has this weak pawn structure, but it's very difficult to win this pawn on c6. I'm assuming Hikaru will go queen d7 and defend it. Okay, he doesn't. He goes for taking on d4. Queen takes on c6. Queen d7. And now I'm actually liking black position. The reason is that e5 pawn is separated from all of white's pawns. If you take on c3, the pawn structure will be really bad. You can play g5. That's a very fascinating move. Forcing the bishop away from the pawn, even though the pawn is actually weaker on e5 than it is on the g7 pawn. Hikaru is trying to eliminate this strong pawn on e5. He's grabbing space in the endgame. Quite a useful idea after pawn takes rook g8. Just launching these pawns down the board to activate his pieces. Okay, the bishop comes back to f4, not getting blocked in by the pawns. Hikaru's taking some time here. He castles. The rook is lined up with the king, so white king moves out of the way. You could take on h3 and go rook g2 check, but after king b1, yeah, black is grabbing space. Knight d3 runs into rook d1, so king c8 is played first. The knight on c3 is a target and also unable to move to a useful square, so he tries for knight b5. Knight d3 hits the pawn. a6 would kick the knight away, and now knight takes d4. Knight takes e5 is playable. The knight on e5 protects that f7 pawn, so Hikaru doesn't need to move it at the moment. But if he wants to take the pawn on c4, he can. Okay, bishop targets the knight, forcing it backwards. Interesting strategic ideas. You can play f6 here. So the knight on e5 can move. Hikaru's activating his king. He wants to bring it to e8, defending the pawn, so the knight can move. And he continues with that plan. The h3 pawn is weak. So this is a huge problem for white. I really like black's position here. The rook dominates the second rank. You can play rook h2. Then rook a4 can be played. Interesting intermediate moves that occur prior to just taking the pawn or going rook a4. He decides to activate his bishop first. So white's playing quite strong, of course, and the idea is he is utilizing are a lot of intermediate moves, and every single move changes the position slightly, and he's taking advantage of it. Okay, in this position, white simply resigns the game. We have no way to stop the pawn from going to h2. Bishop on e7 covers h4. Maybe a little bit too early to resign, but uh, he felt Hikaru was just going to win this game regardless. The pawns on f7, e6 can run down the board. Still, you always have chances for drawing, so quite surprised he would just resign in this position. Maybe you can go rook g8 check, king d7, rook h8, and get behind the pawn. Okay, let's take a look at this game on our analysis. Let's flip the board as well. Hikaru with black against e4. He plays knight f6, Alekhine's defense, an unusual system. First time we've seen it in his game so far. e5, knight e5, t4, knight b6, c4, d6, f4, bishop f5, knight c3, takes, and e6, knight f3. And this is a very difficult move, I think, for beginners to understand. The bishop is already developed. Why not bring more pieces into the game? Well, Hikaru is attacking the pawn on d4 indirectly. The knight defends it and the queen defends it, but his idea is to deflect the queen from the defense of this d4 pawn. As well, strategically, when you have less space, a key idea is trading off pieces. This could be dangerous, though, as well, because you are giving away the bishop, and the position is quite open on these diagonals. Excuse me. Okay, bishop g4, bishop to e2, bishop takes, and knight c6, attacking not only the d4 pawn, but the c4 pawn is hanging as well. White decides to take, and white does have a nice opening advantage. And after queen f3, he loses his advantage immediately because of queen takes on d4. Surprisingly, black also had this opportunity to give a check and then take on d4. Even better is castles, taking on d4 in this way. And if bishop to e3, knight takes on c4, attacking the bishop and the pawn. Bishop f2, and queen g5 is the top move here. Okay, queen takes, queen d7. We have an equal position. Black has a slight edge because of this weak pawn on e5. Bishop f4 is played. Bishop b4. I really like this move, bishop to b4, because it attempts to cripple white's pawn structure permanently. And what's interesting is how Hikaru kept the pressure on the knight, not taking the knight, but using it as a threat, and also putting the bishop on a very active square. King moves to d2, defending the knight, so there's no crippling of the pawn structure. And Hikaru finds the best move here, pawn g5. The point isn't to take on e5, the point is to play rook to g8, get sizable activity. If you defend the bishop with h4, then after h6, rook takes a check, king moves to e3, and then the e5 pawn falls. And black is doing really well here. Pawn on c4 is hanging, pawn on b2 is hanging, and the king is out in the open. So white correctly avoids this. Bishop g3, h5, h3, h4, bishop h2, and Hikaru again finds the best move, g4, opening up the pathway for the rook. Otherwise, the rook's a dead piece on h8. It's going to take a lot of time to get into the game. You could start with rook g8, which is also perfectly fine with the idea of g4, but he sees the possibility to play it immediately. It also threatens g3, and if the bishop moves, the pawn on e5 falls. So quite an interesting use of pawns on the king side. All of a sudden, these pawns are rolling down the board, not even safe several times. Not safe, not safe again. Rook to g8, rook e1, Hikaru castles, king c2. White still is okay here. Engine prefers black, but white is holding. Knight c5, rook d1, takes, and this was actually a really critical mistake here. Better was rook d1, king c8, and then taking. And the point is that after rook gives a check, the rook can block on d2. So an opportunity to do an intermediate move, a check, and white missed it. Now black has a very strong rook on the second rank, dominating white's position. King c8 is played. If knight d3, which looks like it attacks b2, it runs into a pin on the d file and white is winning. So king c8 getting out of the pin first. Knight to b5. White struggling to find a plan here. The bishop is defending a pawn, which he isn't under attack at the moment. He doesn't have any good squares to keep stability on. From f6 doesn't really do too much. I think it does hit the pawn on h4, which is nice, but it can't be played at all at the moment anyways. So it's really difficult to find a plan here for white. Best move is rook h2, trading off material and trading off black's most active piece. This is the key idea that white missed in the game. Okay, knight e3, huge advantage for Hikaru. A6, winning one pawn, attacking the knight, bringing the bishop back. He's up a pawn here with a very stable king position, super active rook, and a target on h3. Rook d4, rook to h2, bishop f4, rook h1, and knight c6, moving to safety. I think rook h1 is also quite interesting. He could have... okay, the bishop is attacking it, so rook has to move. Just noticing every detail. Knight c6, and then taking the pawn on h3. He could have taken the pawn right away with rook takes h3, but then the knight falls, so you actually can't. So if the knight moves, you lose this rook. You get the rook back, but the white knight defends. So rook h1, the only move here. Knight c6, rook a4, and now rook takes the pawn, bishop takes pawn, and rook steps out of the way to support the pawn advancing up the board. Rook g4, h3, knight d2, rook f2, and white resigns the game. And I thought this could be played, giving a check and then getting behind the pawn. But we can't do it because the bishop is hanging on c7. Really instructive game and very powerful play by black in this endgame. White didn't have a plan. White didn't have counterplay. Let's put it in our analysis of this game. So game number 3, we have an opening, Alekhine's defense, and cool move, bishop g4. So bishop f5, and then as soon as the knight developed, bishop g4. Main reason for win, black's rook got very active, causing tactical problems for white, and black used his pawns on the king side to continuously expand and get activity. Black also never took the pawn on e5 for a very long time and kept this pawn as a target where white constantly needed to defend it. That's also really interesting. Main reason for loss is white should have contested the rook on the second rank instead of abandoning the king side. Alright, notes. Black's expansion with the king side pawn maturity was critical for timing and getting and initiative. White also lost his opening advantage by giving away the d4 pawn or the weak c6 pawn. Alright, let's take a look at the next game.